Welcome to the Slow Living Collective podcast. I'm Amy, wife, mother of two, and homemaker. Come along with me as I share my love for simple living, growing in my allotment garden, diving into what it means to be an urban homesteader, and embracing life as a mother and homemaker. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Slow Living Collective podcast. Thank you so much for joining me here today. Today I have a really exciting episode, and I say that every time, but honestly, I get to speak to some amazing people on this podcast, and I always come away from my podcast recording session so buoyed up, so just I just love it. I love recording this podcast, and I just love being able to talk to some just incredible people. And today is no different. Today I'm talking to Elizabeth, and we are delving into the difficult topic of breastfeeding, grief and trauma. Now, of course, I just want to preface this episode with a bit of a trigger warning. We are going to be talking about breastfeeding. We're going to be talking about breastfeeding trauma. We're going to be talking about the grief when breastfeeding doesn't work out the way you envisioned it. There's also mention in this episode of eating disorders. So if any of these things are triggering to you, please protect your mental health, and maybe we'll catch you in the next episode. So with that being said, let's jump into today's episode. So, hi Elizabeth, welcome to the Slow Living Collective podcast, and thank you for joining me here today. Before we get into today's episode, do you want to introduce yourself to everyone and let us know a little bit about who you are?
Sure. So my name is Elizabeth. I grew up in the United States, in Pennsylvania, and I went, to school here up and through university. And when I went, my third year in university, we had an opportunity to go study abroad, and I chose to go to France because ever since I was a little girl and saw this very cheesy romantic comedy called French Kiss, I always dreamed about living in France. So I followed that 9-year-old dream of mine. And I went to Paris and I studied there, and I ended up meeting the person who's now my husband. And so I went back to university, finished my last year there, and then basically, we made our life in France for quite a while. We had our son there in Paris, and then moved around a little bit. We spent a year back in the United States. We moved to Switzerland just before COVID, so I spent about 2 years there, and now we're settled back down in France. And I used to work in content marketing, and then when our daughter was born in Switzerland, I decided to stay home with them and to home educate. So that's what we're doing now in rural France. We're home educating, and my husband is working, and we've gotten into a nice little groove there.
Fantastic. So, today we're going to be talking about breastfeeding and breastfeeding grief and trauma. And it's a difficult conversation, but I'm really excited to dive into it with you. So, I'm a mother of two, and I've had two very different experiences, similar in some ways, but very different as well with breastfeeding. And when I opened up about my experience, particularly online, with my first child, I found that my experience maybe wasn't as unique as I thought it was. So, starting right at the beginning, for me, I found breastfeeding education to be what I thought was fine at the time, but in hindsight, it didn't remotely cover what I was about to experience, particularly difficulties, when to reach out for support. So, when it came to breastfeeding, what were your thoughts about it before you had your first child? What were your expectations around breastfeeding and things like that?
Yeah, so I had also like I knew that breastfeeding was harder than I think a lot of, narratives would like, us to think. So I knew going in, they say breastfeeding is natural. They say, that it's easy, blah, 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 but that it's not. So I knew that there were mechanics to it. I took a breastfeeding education course with a lactation consultant about latch. I felt like I was prepared going into it, but I also felt armed, with the fact that, okay, it takes time. Okay, every woman can breastfeed, like you can do it. And I really ate up this narrative of like, don't let anyone get in between you and your desire to breastfeed. So I kind of went in very defensive and, very, sealed off from any possibility that this, was not going to work out. But that's reflective of my personality. I tend to just dive into things headfirst, being like, there's no way this is not working out.
So I know your first experience with breastfeeding left you with some trauma. Would you share with us how that first experience played out?
Yeah, so again, I knew going into it that it would not be easy, that I would have to work for it, that my baby and I were a partner and we had to work together. Um, and so, I was at the hospital, I had this amazing natural birth. I mean, that was the other thing that was very important to me. I wanted to have an unmedicated birth. I, had my son. I just felt like a superhero. I was so, pleased with how things went. I was so proud of myself. And then, I was, he was placed in my chest. I mean, I feel like that early advice of, how to manage breastfeeding, lots of skin to skin, all of that protocol was, followed. And then, I was at the hospital. I didn't do a home birth. I was at the hospital and my milk didn't come in. And my milk still didn't come in. And, my son was obviously, not a very happy baby, very traumatic at the hospital, received very little support there. And what by the time we checked out, he had lost sort of the sort of acceptable 10% of his birth weight. He was a small baby at birth. But he was like in the 99th percentile for height. So he was like a very, like when you looked at him, you're like, wow, this kid is skinny. Not that he was, not that his weight in and of itself was that low, but you just kind of looked at him, you're like, wow, you're a string bean. So we checked out of the hospital, and the first, thing that I did was call the lactation consultant with whom I had done this breastfeeding education course, and she came over. She took one look at my son. She took a look at his chart and was like, I have no idea why they let you out of the hospital without giving you formula. This is from a lactation consultant, Amy. Like
Yeah.
this, I thought that lactation consultants were supposed to be your number one champion. And this woman who like looked at my son was like, he's dehydrated. He does not have, he is not getting enough. You need to get him on formula right away. This was her first reaction. And, my gut, it was like, well,
Yeah.
who the bleep do you think you are? You don't even know me. You're not doing your job. That was my reaction to her. So I said, okay, I understand. Not all consultants are created equal. Not everyone approaches their, profession the same way. This person obviously, should get a different job if she is not in the business of supporting breastfeeding, parents, then she should not do this job. So I just completely ignored her and basically said, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear, but I said basically, what a bitch. And I just scoffed at her recommendations and, persisted. So basically, to sum up, I spent 2 months um basically living in fear of the next like weight check-in and pediatrician's appointment, because every time everyone around me was saying, your son is not gaining enough weight. He was gaining, he was not losing weight, but he is not gaining enough weight. You really need to start thinking about supplementing. But I said, basically, I was living under the notion of the second that you let formula touch a child's lips, breastfeeding is over, because that was the rhetoric that I was hearing. And I was just, in between, I was feeding around the clock and I was pumping, and I was basically just living as this prisoner to breastfeeding, and spending every waking moment and hour, any free time that I had, researching low supply. And what I was getting was this idea that there is no such thing as low supply.
Mhm.
Like breast size does not matter. Low supply is a myth, blah, blah, blah. I've just heard the only thing that I was reading online in these communities was basically your experience is not valid. Your body is a lemon. You're a screw up because this does not exist. And so that was where the trauma was, is that I didn't find anything that was saying, look, there are some women that do not produce enough milk, especially with a first child. I didn't get that anywhere. So I said, wow, I'm a complete failure. My body is just absolutely not working the way that nature has intended me to. So it just really caused a lot of self-hatred and a lot of guilt. So yeah, and I think that what is tough about those early months and why there's this heavy focus on how mothers choose to feed their babies is it's like really the first measure of like what is a good mother. Like you can't really like tell, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like, you're a mother, your baby's supposed to be growing. That's the only thing we expect of babies at that age, that they grow, that they get bigger. And so, it was like, okay, well, I'm a terrible mother. My child, like, I don't think that there's any more visceral of an emotion than like my child is not thriving and it's because of me.
yeah,
And just basically my biggest regret, I don't regret any ounce of formula that my son got. I mean, to at the time, like I was like calculating, I was like, okay, well, like how many ounces of breast milk did he get today versus how many ounces of formula? Like I was determined to at least like come in first.
yeah,
But that's honestly the only regret that I have, is that like I spent so long refusing to just like give him the nourishment that he needed. Like he just needed formula in the beginning. Like he really did. He was
yeah,
hungry. And it's like I don't know, there's nothing more terrible than feeling like, okay, well, yeah, I let my child go, not starving, but I let my child go hungry for so long because I was so trapped in this like black and white thinking. So yeah, that was, it's a huge burden to carry. And like when you're a first time mother, you don't have that perspective of like, you know, who the hell cares, how many ounces of whatever your child is drinking. Like you just need your child to, be healthy and getting the nourishment that they need. But at the time it was a huge deal for me. And I think that, so my 20s I had an eating disorder, and I think that I the other thing, like when I was preparing, like during pregnancy, everyone's like, oh well, be prepared, like for eating disorder survivors, like pregnancy is really hard because your body changes and whatever. And like I found like that was not an issue for me, that was not triggering at all. But then like you get to breastfeeding and it's like you yeah, it's like everything is about weight and everything is about weighing and everything is about calculating the number of ounces and calories that your child is consuming. And it was terrible for me. Like that was the hardest part, was just that like falling back into this ED mindset of like, okay, output, like when I was pumping, it was like the amount of ounces that I pumped in a day would basically determine my self-worth and how much I loved myself that day. So that was the trauma. I think that like, yeah, I think that my trauma is very, sort of related to my personal, history. But I think that it all stems from this idea that in the breastfeeding community, like if you don't exclusively breastfeed, like you don't, and you can't produce enough, like you virtually don't exist.
yeah. It's
So
it's interesting because as you were talking, I was thinking back to, what you said about how, you know, there's no such thing as low supply. And I had read the same thing
yeah,
online as well. And, like in the middle of the night when, you're trying to feed a baby and, you're researching it on the internet. And I remember, so with my first my daughter, my birth was a traumatic. I wouldn't explain it as a traumatic birth, like, I don't hold any trauma from it, but in terms of, how it played out, it was quite traumatic. And, I didn't have, much skin to skin. I didn't have, we didn't initiate breastfeeding probably quick enough, maybe. But, a lot of the what happens to me was because of that, probably because of my birth. I had a postpartum hemorrhage.
Mm,
I was just really poorly after I had her and just wasn't feeling that good. And
yeah.
when I almost didn't have the energy to,
Mm,
to be feeding all the time, and it was just like this constant pull because I wanted it so badly. Ironically, I didn't know I wanted it so badly until I started doing it. When I was pregnant, I was like, oh, well, if I can breastfeed, it'll be fine. But if I can't, then, I'll just use formula. And I wish I could have had that mindset when I was in the thick of it.
yeah.
Because like I did everything, pumping and my output, when you first start pumping and you get like not even an
Three drops. Yeah.
and it's so demoralizing because you're
Yeah.
like, I am working so hard. I've been stuck to this pump for half an hour and I don't even have an ounce of milk.
Well, like, I don't know about you, but I am very much of the like personality type. It's like, I don't get it. I am doing everything right and I am not getting the outcome. Like, I just, I'm someone who likes to play by the rules and I get very frustrated when things don't go my way. And that was really hard for me during breastfeeding because, like you said, I was on Google, researching. Literally, the house could have been on fire, and I would have been stuck to my phone researching
Yeah.
how to boost milk supply. And I was doing everything, and I was buying all the things, and I was following all the random YouTuber advice. And I was like, if I'm doing all of the things, it must be me. The problem is me. And that, that was just too hard for me to swallow because yeah, I mean, yeah, it's terrible. It's terrible to feel like you are the problem and you are alone in having this problem.
Yeah, and especially when, you're reading things that say there's no such thing as low supply, and you're
Oh,
like, well, then it must be a me thing then. And,
yeah.
it's just, it's not the case that, there are, some people that just cannot produce milk or cannot produce milk to the extent that maybe is needed. And it's ironic to me because I really struggled to have any kind of milk production with my daughter, and I overproduced in my
Mm,
pregnancy. And the amount of times, like, I had bottles of it, like I had to pump. I went through exactly the same thing, losing weight with this was with both of them. They lost loads of weight. Everybody was starting to get a little bit fidgety about
yeah.
they're losing a bit too much weight now. And it went in exactly the same cycle the second time round. And it was only I went to a lactation consultant who was a savior. But I know it's not the case for everyone. And you're not the first person that I've heard say that their lactation consultant wasn't the savior that they needed and the support that they needed. But, I went to with the second one, I went to a lactation consultant, and, we were very quickly were able to sort of, get his weight up.
Mm.
He had prolonged jaundice as well, so everyone was very fussy about that. And, it ultimately, I had absolutely bottles and bottles and bottles of breast milk but it's almost to the point where I would look at it and think, "Why this time? Why now? Like, I've got more than I need. I could feed 2 babies with this. Why couldn't I
Mhm.
have had some of this last time?" And so I think it's just a bit of a testament to however you go on to feed future children, should you have them, it doesn't negate the first experience. It doesn't go away. And
No, for sure, for sure.
yeah,
And going into so we had my second, so when we had our daughter, I really the main takeaway from our experience with our son is if there are any issues in the beginning, just feed her. And that's like, that was my mantra going in. Just feed her, no matter whatever she needs, just feed her. And, and I was prepared. And, I had done all the research. I was working with a different lactation consultant, someone, that I actually found on Instagram. Was following her for a long time, and like really, and I had met with her during pregnancy and really connected with her. And so yeah, so I felt prepared to be disappointed. I just went in being like, okay, yes, you produce, your body, creates more milk glands for the second baby, but that doesn't mean that, you can be EBF. But so let's just see what happens. But no matter what you do, just feed her. And so we went through the same thing. She lost the weight, and this trusted lactation consultant pretty much had the same advice as the first one that I met, except that I was willing to sort of, yeah, hear it the second time around.
Yeah.
And I started combo feeding, and I would give her a little formula and give her and nurse and pump and basically do what I did the first time around. And because I was giving her formula, she really had the strength and the, stamina to get my production up. And I was able to, for a while, be EBF. And that for me was very healing. Now, once I went back to work, it got ran into all the classic problems with daycare and, them claiming that I didn't have enough, breast milk, whatever, to last the whole day. But by that point, I had just accepted that, my children need both. I'm not this overproducer. I'm never going to have, bottles and bottles and bottles. But, there are other ways for me to be a good mother. And I am a good mother just because, I'm not, yeah, exactly, overflowing with milk is no reflection of me as a mother.
Absolutely.
Um, but
Absolutely.
I would say that the one thing, so this lactation consultant, it actually wasn't my lactation consultant, it was my midwife in Switzerland. And in Switzerland, funnily enough, I feel like this doesn't really go along with their stereotype, are very into like homeopathic solutions, right? And alternative medicine.
Okay.
Um, and she said, have you ever thought about acupuncture for breastfeeding? And I said, no, I never thought about it. And who would have thought? But actually, Amy, that was the thing that kept my supply up. Was once every 2 or 3 weeks, I would have an acupuncture session, and it really boosted my supply. And I was reading up on it, and basically, there's this idea in Chinese medicine that sort of like all of the period blood that gets stored during pregnancy, and then after pregnancy, while you're breastfeeding, you're not menstruating, that all of that blood is then turned into your milk.
Oh, wow.
And so the acupuncture basically was aimed at getting my blood flow up. And that's what really helped, actually, boost, not, again, not to a place where I could, exclusively breastfeed, but I think it made a huge difference between, in terms of my mental health. So acupuncture would be my suggestion. If you are, it's not cheap either. And I'm not suggesting that, but I know that I spent a lot of, time and money researching these supplements that didn't work for me, but acupuncture did. So that was a win for with our daughter.
That's really, really interesting. And it's just, there's so much noise around breastfeeding, and I find, when you're in the thick of it and it's not working for you the way you want it to, it's very easy, isn't it, to be like, I'll try this, I'll try this, I'll try this.
Mm.
I remember my midwife um recommended trying like I think it was fenugreek capsule.
Yep.
They tasted bad. They tasted really bad. I'm not sure they worked either. But it's just, my experience with my first ended at 6 weeks. And I just going back to what you said earlier about like equating formula to ending breastfeeding.
Mm.
And it's funny because I had that feeling with my first, and because my first, I think probably what happened, because she was very, very hungry, my milk just wasn't there. I was unwell, like I said, as well, and I was in this like real like push pull situation where we had got formula ahead of time, because I was very
Mm.
like relaxed about whether I was going to breastfeed or not. So we had formula on hand, and I remember being like, we've got to do something. I've got to feed her. I've got to do something. Um I remember holding her in front of me, and I could smell on her breath like almost like an alcohol kind of smell, and I
Oh.
knew that that was like ketones, right? I knew that was that she was really, really hungry. And so I
Oh.
called my um like like the midwife unit. You could call, like, you could, I think, a couple of weeks after you've given birth, you can still be in contact with them, and was like, I'm feeding her. What can I do? I can smell this smell on her. And they were like, oh, I don't know what that is. I'm like, I do. I know. And so I said to my husband, just get the formula. Like, I've
Yeah.
got to do something. We've got to get something into her. And, like, she guzzled that bottle down.
Yeah.
I remember feeling like overjoyed my baby's eating. I'm so
Mm.
overjoyed, but at the same time, like, heartbroken, like, that's not my milk. And
Yeah.
I really struggled with that. And it's something that I think I held on to with a lot of like my breastfeeding trauma for a while. That feeling of like, I am so grateful for formula. I will never knock formula.
Yeah.
I love it because, it saves so many babies' lives. Um,
Yeah.
but at the same time, I hated it. I hated it with a passion. Every bottle, I was like, "Ugh," like, it's not my milk. And I found that difficult. And, I can laugh about it now, like, but
Yeah, it's almost laughable to be jealous of a powder. I
yeah,
mean, but it's real. I mean, you are jealous and you are resentful of this box of food. I mean, a box of food. But yeah, no, absolutely. I feel like I am a like a radical a breastfeeding radicalist convert. Like I would never ever say a bad thing about formula again because low supply is real and
yeah,
because X, Y, or Z. I mean, for a number of reasons why, even as a breastfeeding parent, you need formula, and formula is not the enemy, and formula can be an ally. Like I said, with our daughter, I think that I did have that nice little grace period of just breastfeeding her because she was strong enough to get my production where I needed to be. Whereas my son was not, he
yeah.
was just really kind of, at a very, very low baseline all the time. So yeah, nothing bad to say about formula whatsoever.
Yeah, same. And it's funny because second time round with my son, um, like I said, same sort of things happened. Everybody's starting to get a bit fidgety about his weight, and they were like, "We're gonna have to do top up feeds," and I was like,
Yeah.
"Oh." And so we did. I remember, because I said to my husband before we had him, I'm breastfeeding. I am not getting a pump because I wasted all that money on that first pump.
Yeah.
Then I sold it. I'm not getting a pump. I'm not getting a pump. And then they were like, we're going to have to do a top up feed. And she said, do you have any formula? And we did. And I was like, right, I'm ordering a breast pump. And the breast pump came, I think it was like on Amazon. It was like it came by like 10 o'clock that night. I was like, sterilize it, let's get going. And,
Yeah.
more through luck than anything, I had a better supply. Probably I didn't have a traumatic birth, a wonderful birth second time round. And maybe that helped. I don't know, I'm just guessing. Maybe it did. It was very different. It's the only thing I can pin between the two that was very different. And
Your body, I mean, it does, I mean, that is true. Like your body does make more milk glands with every successive pregnancy. So I would joke that like, oh, I just need to have 15 babies and I'll be fine. I'll be able to make enough milk.
yeah, but I did give him formula that first day, and then I was able to top up feed him breast milk after that until we were with my lactation consultant. We then, eventually weaned him off the top ups, and he was gaining healthy weight after that, and everybody was
Mm.
happy, and we went on, and we're about to celebrate 2 years of breastfeeding, and
Yeah.
it comes like every milestone. I sometimes, when I talk about it on Instagram, like, I say things like, if you walked in on me now, you would think that, oh, this girl can breastfeed, let's move on. And
Yeah.
it's like, it's still like, the milestone of 2 years is incredible to me from where I came from. I can't even, me of 4 years ago would never have been able to imagine it. Um, but it still is still always tinged with a little bit of sadness. Like, yes, 2 years of breastfeeding my son is incredible, but I couldn't do that to my daughter. And so,
Right.
that the cycle is still there. I feel so much better about breastfeeding, and I think I worked through a lot of it. But I think you still get like these little tinges of sadness here and there.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I breastfed I breastfed my son until so I got pregnant with our daughter when he was 18 months, and then he self-weaned at 21 months. But I was like ready to tandem feed. I was even thinking this is great. If I have a 2-year-old breastfeeding at the same time as my newborn, like he's really going to help my supply.
Yeah.
So I was heartbroken that he self-weaned at 21 months, and now my daughter she's 2.5. She's yeah. And she's still nursing. I wouldn't say she's breastfeeding anymore. I'm not sure how much I'm actually producing, but she's still nursing for sure. And sort of my tinge of regret is more, just more, it stems more from perfectionism, that like even though and it was worse with my son. I basically had convinced myself if I'm not exclusively breastfeeding, I'm not breastfeeding. Like if you would have asked me when I was, when my son was little, I would say, no, I don't breastfeed. And it was ridiculous because I was probably breastfeeding more than anyone on the freaking planet.
Yeah.
I was always putting him at the breast. And, that was, yeah, it's still hard for me to, I don't know. There's a part of me in my mind that said, like, no, you didn't really do this. And that's obviously inner work that I need to do. I know that I breastfed my both of my children, but there is this like perfectionist part of me, and that is egged on by this rhetoric, this kind of like toxic positivity, and this like really radical thinking of like a radical like militantism for exclusive breastfeeding
Yeah.
that really makes people who don't exclusively breastfeed feel like they didn't, because they're
Yeah.
not doing it right, and and they're just invisible from the whole conversation. Either you breastfeed or you formula feed. Like where's the voice of the parents doing both? It's just
Yeah.
not there. And so because I was not exclusively breastfeeding, I didn't breastfeed, which is, on the surface ridiculous, but part of me still carries a bit of that, being like, oh well, I breastfed, but I didn't really breastfeed.
Yeah. Yeah. And to some extent as well, it's like, I fed my son formula for a day. Does that mean that,
Yeah.
does that negate the whole
No.
other 2 years that I've done
Oh,
it? And
yeah.
sometimes I think like, well, I did give him a bit of formula, and like, it's but it, like you say, it comes from this sort of narrative around breastfeeding, that it's like it's all or nothing. You
Yeah.
either sacrificed yourself to breastfeeding or you didn't. And yeah, I just find it, a conversation that, it's just so unhelpful as well to new mothers coming into breastfeeding, because we just see these cycles continue as well, don't we?
Yeah. And I was gonna say, I mean, I'm gonna badmouth a Facebook group in particular. Because well, I'm not gonna badmouth it, but I know that, I maybe won't name it by name, but social media does not help any of this. And it's very natural as a new mother to, sort of immediately hop on social media and look for advice and guidance, because a lot of us, like I know myself, I didn't have a huge support system living abroad. I mean, I think a lot of us have sort of lost this notion of, our village, and so we've transferred it online, but with a lot less of the care and consideration that I think actual people can provide you. But yeah, and so I was on these Facebook groups, and it was like there would be women bragging about, oh, like whatever, 18 months of breastfeeding, not a single drop of formula, like bragging in that. And I know that they were proud, and I was happy for them, mainly jealous, but happy, and I understand it. But like, and then, these groups that basically egg you on. It's like, no, like, dig your claws in even deeper, like resist that formula, or, have you checked for tongue ties? I mean, I'm not even going to get into that, but like, I was convinced that tongue ties had like ruined my breastfeeding, that all along my son had had a tie, and like I didn't recognize it. And I had almost even decided before my daughter was born, it's like, oh, get that, gotta get that tie out. And then when my daughter was here and we were having and I was, not, producing as much as I should, and I called an office in Lausanne, in Switzerland, and they were like explaining the procedure to me, and I was just like, I if this isn't actually the problem, like I'm not going to like mutilate my daughter. Like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like, it's very easy to like want to find this boogeyman. So after hearing more details about the procedure and the recovery process, I said, look, as much as I would love a miracle solution to my problem, if for any reason that has nothing to do with my milk supply, I'm just not willing to put my daughter through this. And I think that there are tongue ties that are real. But so like I didn't, besides the fact that I had low supply, like there was no other indication that my daughter or my son were tied. It's like, yes, they have a frenulum, but like I didn't have any pain. Like I didn't, like my nipples weren't a weird shape after. But it was like, yeah, I kind of had to talk myself back, off of that cliff of like, oh yeah, like let's not jump into a very painful, involved medical procedure just because just because I don't want my daughter to have an ounce of formula.
Yeah.
Like, and my husband was really against it. And, I'm really glad that like, and my lactation consultant was also like, yeah, like it's probably not a tie. But I think that you're just so desperate for these like miracle solutions, whether or not it's a, tie snipping procedure, or like taking moringa, or drinking, 64 ounces of water a day. You really want to find those quick wins. And sometimes there aren't.
Yeah. So my son did have a tongue tie. We didn't get it snipped. He had a mild posterior tongue tie, and yeah, when I saw my lactation consultant, she diagnosed it straight away, and she said it's actually not something that we have to do anything about. She said you
Mm.
can if you want, but so I was having a lot of pain, had a lot of pain, had like a lipstick shaped nipple,
Yeah.
and yeah, just lots of like chafing and bleeding, and just very, very uncomfortable, almost to the point where you're like, I cannot bear to feed a second longer. But you've got to do it, like you didn't have the choice. But so with a few sort of simple adjustments uh,
Mm.
to the way I was feeding, completely solved it, and I never had a problem again. So I was really pleased that I didn't dive into having it snipped. Now, it was just mild, obviously, and there are obviously tongue ties that are worse and do need assistance.
Yeah, treatment. Absolutely. But I was just astounded by like how quickly that advice was being doled out on social media.
Yeah.
Like it's just insane. You're like, are you getting a commission or something?
Yeah.
Are you in bed with these, dentists and whoever, these surgeons that are snipping these babies? I just think that like when there are no other symptoms present and you're just trying to like fix low supply, it just was not, for us, it didn't, yeah, it was not the path that we wanted to go down. So yeah,
And
I had a lot of resentment towards that advice and all, yeah, social media in general.
Yeah, I found social media difficult, and it's you mentioned earlier as well about, when you see other people breastfeeding on social media at the time, like the feeling of like jealousy and stuff. And I was like nodding along because yeah, I remember, when it's like breastfeeding awareness week, I was
Oh,
oh, I
worst week of
can't
the year.
I can't even bear to be here. And
Wow.
it's funny because it still gets me
Oh,
sometimes.
yeah.
And it's like in my head, I'm like, I think, what you've been breastfeeding for 2 years, Amy. Like,
Yeah.
but it's the trauma doesn't go away. And I still find breastfeeding awareness week a tricky one. And
Mm,
I think I find it tricky because I guess to some extent I could say I've seen both sides of the coin, right? I can say that I've had two like polar opposite experiences, and but it is difficult, and it's hard to explain, I think, to people who maybe have just been able to breastfeed with no issue, that
mm,
how difficult it is to see people breastfeeding and even just celebrating breastfeeding.
yeah.
It's like a knife to the heart.
Mm,
And now, as somebody who does breastfeed, I'm so like conflicted, like, well, I'm pleased that I've just got to 2 years, but also like I know by me sharing that, someone out there is feeling like, oh, that hurt.
yeah.
And so it's such a tricky position. But yeah, I completely.
It's a fine line, and, like, I don't want people to walk away from this conversation be like, "Oh, these 2 ladies, like, don't like breastfeeding anymore and
Yeah.
don't wanna talk about it." No, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's wonderful, and I've had many moments of connection, for all the trauma that's being talked about here. Like, there have been lovely moments, and, like, it's been a lifesaver, for me. I know that getting them to sleep, and like, it's been lovely. I feel like my life has been made a lot easier by breastfeeding. In a lot of ways it's made it difficult as well, but I mean, I guess I just wish, from lactation consultants and these social media groups and breastfeeding awareness week, all this stuff, I just feel like yeah, it can veer into toxic positivity a little bit too fast. And there's a fine line between encouraging and just like falling into this black and white thinking that I fell, victim to. I just think that I wish, like you, that I had gone into it a little bit more low stakes. Like, okay, if breastfeeding works out, then that's fine. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But I just feel like breastfeeding gets put on this pedestal and formula gets demonized. And it's just not healthy for anyone. I think what I would wish for any parent, who wishes to breastfeed, like, if you can find it in yourself to really go in it with a neutral mindset, because it truly is neutral. It is not, like, I know, who is that, Casey Davis, struggle care, talks about, messiness is being, or like whatever, cleaning is a morally neutral act. Like, feeding your child is morally neutral. So if you can go into, feeding your newborn with a neutral mindset, that's like the biggest hope that I could give to anyone. Because it really is just about feeding your child, and it is not a reflection of morality or, your abilities to parent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you said that in this conversation that a lot of the trauma that you have stems from the pro breastfeeding community. Um, so in relation to your like first experience where you experienced that, how did all of these views and products, like lactation cookies and supplements and stuff, how did that really affect you when you were in the thick of it, in terms of you know all these things that you could potentially buy to increase your supply?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, the one of the things that has like become crystal clear to me as a mother, even, yeah, much more so than before, is like all of these industries that crop up that are just there to profit from insecure women's insecurities,
Yeah.
right? And so, and obviously like that is capitalism, like that's colonialism that existed prior to me, my breastfeeding journey. But for me personally, that's kind of how it all crystallized in my mind. And I just became really resentful because those products sort of keep you in that mental prison of like, oh, like I can buy my way out of this.
Hmm.
Just, like you can, just like all the other narratives, capitalistic narratives that say you can buy your way to sustainability, buy your way to this, buy your way to that. And so, I just think that capitalism plus this like extremely vulnerable time, this extremely visceral time when you're just trying to feed your child, just felt like, a real kick to the stomach. And I just got really resentful because you're not tricked. I mean, they don't have to prove anything. I mean, the wellness industry and at large doesn't really have to prove anything, right? Any of their claims. That's a whole other topic, but so they don't have to claim, they don't have to prove anything. So you're selling these unproven, you're hawking unproven promises to vulnerable women, and then make it, and then just keeping them in this false, giving them false optimism that they can find a quick solution, and b, when it doesn't work out, and for some women it does. I mean, I think that I don't want to negate any women's, or any lactating parents experience if they did take moringa pills and it helped, or they did, I said I used acupuncture and it did work. It might not work for another parent. So I'm not negating that, but I just think that, yeah, it's just another way that these industries really just are there to make a profit of you feeling bad about yourself at 3 in the morning, and your child is screaming because they're hungry.
Absolutely. I mean, I have purchased many a thing from Amazon on a
Yes.
night feed, and then when it arrives the next day, I'm like, "Oh, I don't even remember ordering that."
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah, so you're so right. There are all these things that they can profit off of. I mean, even now, if I recently bought something that had oats in it, and I was like, oh, this will make like
Yeah.
give me loads of milk, and I'm like, does it, or do I just get that from somewhere? Like, I've never noticed having oats actually gives me more milk, and I'm at a point now where, like you said earlier, I don't really know how much milk I'm sort of producing, but yeah, so there's all these different things, and like you say, it might work for some and not for others, and it's you know who
And
knows.
it's tricky. I mean, it's tricky because, yeah, you want to try anything. If it worked for someone, it's worth a shot. Obviously, there's nothing bad in that. I'm also don't want to shame people who are trying these things. I tried them all, absolutely. But yeah, it's just, obviously they're not going to market their marketing line isn't going to be, well, may work, may not.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that within the breastfeeding community, like, yeah, I just feel like there was a little bit more realism about like there are no quick wins. Like you need to do your best that you can. You need to obviously trust yourself and be determined if you are determined to breastfeed. But there comes a point where I just wish that people would say, yeah, like you may not be able to produce enough, and that's okay.
Yeah.
I just wish that there was more of that narrative, that like, yeah, that combination feeding exists, and it's valid, and should be celebrated. I just feel like, again, like in these breastfeeding awareness, it's like there, maybe it's my assumption, but I just feel like it's exclusive breastfeeding that it's being celebrated and nothing else. So
Yes.
I wish that all forms of like nursing and breastfeeding, were held up during these, campaign weeks.
Yeah, and also like people who are exclusively pumping, like you
Yeah.
don't you don't hear sort of, anything, there's no week for exclusive that I know of, that, there's no week for exclusively pumping.
Yeah.
And, the focus does lie heavily, I feel as well, on exclusively breastfeeding. And yeah, it's just it's difficult, because breastfeeding, I think, like you said, it's held up on such a pedestal,
Yeah.
and then when it doesn't work out for whatever reason, you end up feeling like, well, why can't I
Why
do it?
me?
Yeah, it's supposedly the most natural thing in the world. Why can't I do the most natural thing
Yeah.
in the world? What's wrong with me? And something I've realized, is breastfeeding grief and trauma in all its formats. Everybody's experience is different. It's just so common, but also really underrepresented in our society, because I mean, we have here in the UK, they don't do it now, but they used to commission this sort of like infant feeding report, and
Mhm.
it said something like, at birth, something like 70% of women initiate breastfeeding, and by
Mhm.
6 weeks, something like only 20% or
Yeah.
30% are still breastfeeding. And it's like, why do you not, why can't you help? Why is there no
Yeah.
support? Where does it fall down? Because I mean, with my son, I in hospital, I asked anybody that passed my bed, is he latched properly? Is he latched properly?
Oh,
I didn't,
yeah.
I didn't even care if they were a health worker. I'm like, excuse me,
The
whoever you are,
janitor or the
yeah,
yeah.
can you just check, is he latched properly? And they were all like, yeah, he's fine. Like, he wasn't fine. He wasn't latched properly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so, there's this, I don't know if this is sort of like maybe not the world over, but, certainly in the Western world over, we have like really low breastfeeding rates. And,
Mm.
we hear about it, here in the UK, we hear about the low breastfeeding rates all the time. And it's like, yeah, but you don't help us. There are some of us that really, really, really want to do it. And, I had to pay for a lactation consultant. Our healthcare is free, but I had to pay, and I refused to let it be that to be able to quote unquote successfully breastfeed,
Yeah.
you have to pay for it. Like,
Yeah, that's the other, along with there's no such thing as low supply, the one thing that I never, ever, ever want to hear, ever again is breastfeeding is free. It is not free.
it is
You
not.
know, if you absolutely, like you said, besides paying for a lactation consultant, sessions and breast pumps and all of the replacement, all the little replacement parts, and then, all of the whatever, if you buy the supplements, if you, buy things, if you have time to take time off of work. I mean, I don't know what the maternity leave is, in the UK. In Europe, it's a little bit better than the US. I mean, my mom went back to work at 6 weeks. She was
Yeah.
a doctor. She
Yeah.
exclusively breastfed my brother for 6 weeks, and that's it. And then then she did combo feeding because she couldn't keep up with the pumping schedule. So she just nursed my brother when she was around. And like, she didn't go into whether or not that caused her any trauma, but like that's just the reality, is that women go back to work really early in the United States. And I know how hard I work to combo feed, and I know that there I would say I persisted quite stupidly at some times, because my mental health was just completely shot. I should have just, it really is hard to know, okay, when do I give up, because this persistence is causing me as much pain as it is pleasure.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I mean, if you don't have access to a long maternity leave to really, get breastfeeding on the right rails or whatever, yeah, I mean, it's not a surprise. And what's ironic is that in France, no one breastfeeds, and they have like the longest. I mean, so I had a 4-month maternity leave, and then you can take what they call like a parent leave, un congé parental, and it's 1 year where they guarantee your job for a whole year. You're not paid, but like they just, you can just walk right back in a year later. And so, if you're a breastfeeding parent, that's great. You basically have, 16 months at home with your baby. And then yeah, but none of them do. Because I think there's a lot of cultural reasons why not. But anyway, if you don't have these systems in place, of course breastfeeding is going to be too difficult.
Yeah, I mean, here we have 9 months of paid maternity leave, and then we can take 3 months, so a year total, but the
So a
last three
year total,
months,
yeah.
yeah, the last three
That's
months are
lush.
paid. Yeah,
Yeah.
so it is a good amount of time. Lots of people will take their full year, but also lots of people financially have to go back at the 9 months. They can't afford to take those final three unpaid
Yeah.
as well. So, like you say, you need to have those right things in place. And I remember something people used to say to me, like when I was struggling with my first, it's like, oh, it gets easier like after the first 12 weeks. And I'm like, 12 weeks? That's three
Yeah.
months.
Yeah, that's a long time. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I know. Everyone was saying like, it takes a full 8 weeks to get breastfeeding, sort of like set up. And that was the other thing is that like, I'm not saying that the people around me had ill will or were, whatever, trying to sabotage my son's health, but like, from a good place, they were like, yeah, breastfeeding takes time. Like you will get there, you will get there. But just, I just wish that in the you will get there journey, I just wish that someone would say like it's not gonna stop breastfeeding if you give him some formula. I think that was just what I really needed to hear, is that like, you can combination feed it. Like, yes, it will take time. No, your son will not, have nipple confusion. I just really needed to hear more of that. I
Yeah,
was just thinking about like how, this what did you say, like, you reach for the moon, and the worst comes to worst, you land among the stars. But it's
yeah,
like, if the breastfeeding is the moon, if this is on the pedestal, you're made to feel like if you don't land there, you're landing, in the gutter. If you are in these, this breastfeeding, pro breastfeeding community and mindset, you're just made to, feel like, oh God, if you don't do this right, you're left with a terrible option, which is completely untrue.
yeah. Yeah, this I think it's the narrative around exclusively breastfeeding just makes it almost impossible to succeed, because a lot of
Yeah.
people do have issues, and actually once you start sort of unpicking it, or sharing with other people, they're like, oh God, yeah, I actually my beginning of my breastfeeding journey was a nightmare as
Yeah.
well. And it's like, I was talking to a friend of mine and who breastfed for over a year, and we were just discussing breastfeeding a long time ago now, and then she was like, oh, like the whole year was a nightmare, and I'm like, "Oh, I thought you were having a good time."
Oh,
And, it's just like, at the time, we had babies, pretty much at the same time, and, at the time I was consumed with my own,
yeah.
breastfeeding trauma, and, then you come to find out, the more you speak to people, the more you find out that, actually lots of people are sitting with trauma from feeding in some capacity. And
Yeah.
I I never went straight to formula. But sometimes people who went straight to the formula, like straight to feeding with formula, almost feel like they need to justify themselves as well. And it's like the whole infant feeding is just a mess,
Yeah.
because, nobody should have to justify
No.
themselves onto why they did what and for what reason, and yeah, I just think the whole thing is just
Yeah, and I had friends, like especially French friends. Like I said, it's, breastfeeding is not sort of as popular or as high up on a pedestal there as it is maybe in more, Anglo countries. But anyway, like I felt myself jealous as well of my formula feeding friends, because they just didn't they you know their whole mind wasn't consumed by, this whole feeding question 24/7. I was just like, oh my God, like, obviously, like, there were other stresses of motherhood that were keeping them up at night, but I was like, must be so nice to just like, when your baby is hungry, like, you feed them. Like, it wasn't fraught like it was with me, and I just was like, like, wow, like I was like, who's the dummy here?
Yeah,
Why, and so, yeah, the parents who decide to feed formula, they shouldn't feel like they need to justify. If that's the best choice for them, then that's a great option as well. So, yeah, it's damned if you do, damned if you don't.
absolutely. I think that's like the motto of parenting.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So when it comes to like the two experiences you've had with both your children, what would you say, if anything, that you learned from your first experience that you took on into the second?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just in general, it let me like let go of a lot of like black and white thinking, like at my own like the black and white thinking that was keeping me in a bad place mental health wise and physically. Just that, like, there is a middle ground. And so, just this mantra of just feed her. I mean, it took me a while to get there. It took me a while to be like, okay, like, there's no such way of, there's no such thing as like a right way to feed your child. There is, you can do both. You don't have to be so extreme and dig your claws in so much when you're presented with a viewpoint that clashes with your own. I think that I found a lot of middle ground. I would say a sort of middle way of thinking, which helped me with my daughter's experience, that I didn't have with my son. So I think and it was even like more of a life lesson in general, that, like, for example, I was vegan for a very, very long time before, I had my son, and I continued to be vegan for a while. But then it's like COVID, I was in Switzerland and it was COVID and I was pregnant, and like there was like the one takeout place that was open and I could get food at, like, didn't have vegan, food. And so that idea of like just feed her, or just feed your child, actually I was like, just feed yourself, just take care of yourself. Like, you don't have to be trapped in this radical, black and white thinking. Just nourish yourself.
Yeah.
And so I ended up just like, quote unquote, sacrificing my ideals just because I needed to, put food in my body. And that's
Yeah.
okay. And that's not like me, failing myself. That's just me taking care of myself. So I think that was, out of all of this trauma, I think that the overall lesson was, do the best that you can and just make sure you're taking care of yourself and not making any grave sacrifices in the name of an ideal.
Elizabeth, it's been wonderful to have you here today and share what I know is an incredibly hard and personal experience. So thank you so much for sharing. And yeah, just thank you for
Thank
being here. I appreciate it so much.
Of course, yes, and thank you, Amy. I know that you were the first person on social media that ever, it was the first place I ever saw the phrase breastfeeding trauma, and I felt so seen and so validated. So thank you for having these conversations, and I'm really, it's been very cathartic to be a part of.
I'm glad. Thank you so much for being here. Oh my goodness, that was just an amazing conversation with Elizabeth, and I'm so grateful to have people on this podcast like Elizabeth who are willing to talk about their experiences, even though they can sometimes be difficult to rehash and difficult to discuss. So thank you so much, Elizabeth, for coming on. These conversations are not always easy, especially when you've experienced things like breastfeeding and grief and trauma. They are really difficult sometimes to be able to find the words and, to even feel strong enough to be able to share. So thank you so much for Elizabeth for coming on. Thank you guys so much for listening. And as usual, you can connect with me online at Life on Plot 44 on Instagram, or you can follow my blog, theslowlivingcollective.com. So until next time, thank you guys so much for listening, and I will catch you in the next episode.